Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Abraham Lincoln stands beside Allan Pinkerton and Major General John A. McClernand in a camp during the American Civil War. The image was taken in Antietam, Maryland in September 1862, shortly after the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. Lincoln visited the battlefield to discuss strategies with his generals. The Battle of Antietam was a turning point, as it led Lincoln to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. This image shows the gallows prepared for the execution of the conspirators in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, carried out on July 7, 1865, at the Washington prison with the Capitol in the background. 4 people were convicted and hanged on this day, including Mary Surratt, who became the first woman to be executed by the United States government. Lewis Powell, one of the conspirators involved in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Powell was one of John Wilkes Booth's accomplices and was assigned to kill the United States Secretary of State, William H. Seward, as part of a larger plan to destabilize the Union government after the American Civil War. In the photo, John L. Burns, known as the Old Hero of Gettysburg, sits with a gun by his side and crutches leaning against him in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in July 1863. Burns, a veteran of the War of 1812, courageously participated in the Battle of Gettysburg. The image portrays General William Tecumseh Sherman, a central figure in the American Civil War, mounted on his horse, observing the battlefield. Known for his total war strategy aimed at undermining the enemy's combat capability by destroying vital resources, Sherman led the famous March to the Sea in 1864, a devastating campaign across Georgia that was decisive for the Union's victory. This image shows the camp of the Colored Tennessee Battery during the Siege of Vicksburg in Johnsonville, Tennessee in 1864. Formed by African-American soldiers, this unit was part of the USCT, United States Colored Troops, composed of black men who fought for the Union. The Siege of Vicksburg was a strategic point in the American Civil War, essential for control of the Mississippi River. The image shows Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Army commander during the American Civil War and the 18th President of the United States. Grant led Union forces in several decisive battles, including Vicksburg and Chattanooga, gaining recognition for his determination and strategic skills. After the conflict, Grant was elected president, serving from 1869 to 1877, during which he fought for the country's reconstruction and the protection of newly freed slaves' civil rights. Frederick Douglass, one of the most important abolitionists, writers, and speakers of the 19th century. Born enslaved in 1818, Douglass managed to escape slavery and became a key figure in the fight for abolition in the United States. He used his eloquence and personal experiences to expose the brutality of slavery and advocate for African Americans' rights. The photo shows General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army, posing in his full uniform. This image was taken after Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, which marked the effective end of the American Civil War. As one of the most prominent and controversial figures of the conflict, Lee led the Confederate Army in several significant battles, including Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville. William Mahone was a multifaceted figure of the American Civil War era, known for his work as a civil engineer and railroad executive, as well as his staunch support for the Confederate cause. In 1861, with Virginia's secession, he demonstrated his cunning by capturing the Gosport Navy Yard, located in Portsmouth, Virginia. Still a civilian at the time, Mahone used a daring tactic. He drove a noisy, empty passenger train towards the yard, leading Federal troops to believe they were under attack, causing them to abandon the site. After this feat, he was commissioned as a colonel in the Confederate Army, where he continued to distinguish himself through his leadership. In the post-war period, Mahone did not retire from public life, serving as a United States Senator from Virginia in 1881, continuing to exert influence in a new era of Southern Reconstruction and reorganization. This is a photograph of General Philip Sheridan, a prominent Union officer during the American Civil War. Known for his crucial role in the Western Theater campaigns and later in the Shenandoah Valley operations, Sheridan was admired for his bravery and aggressive leadership. Under his command, Union troops achieved decisive victories that significantly weakened Confederate forces. In 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman's soldiers were tasked with destroying the railroads of Atlanta, Georgia, before their withdrawal. This act was part of Sherman's total war strategy, known as the March to the Sea, aimed at dismantling the South's infrastructure, preventing the transport of supplies, and weakening Confederate support lines. Union soldiers in trenches during the Battle of Petersburg in 1864. They are resting and preparing amid the intense siege that lasted for months, one of the longest and most exhausting campaigns of the American Civil War. The trenches, a key element of this confrontation, changed the war's landscape, introducing a closer, defensive style of combat that would later influence strategies in World War I. The man in the center is holding a surgeon's instruments. The image documents an amputation. During the American Civil War, amputations were frequent procedures due to the lack of proper treatment for severe injuries, such as those caused by musket and artillery bullets. African American soldiers of the 107th United States Colored Infantry pose with rifles in front of a structure at Fort Corcoran, Virginia, around 1863. This regiment was part of the colored troop units organized by the Union during the American Civil War, composed of African American soldiers who played crucial roles in the war effort. A group of Union soldiers gathers around a large Dictator mortar during the Siege of Petersburg, Virginia, in 1864. This 13-inch mortar, mounted on a railway platform, was one of the largest weapons used in the American Civil War. Capable of firing heavy projectiles over long distances, it was employed by Union forces to bombard Confederate defenses during the prolonged Siege of Petersburg. The photo was taken during the Battle of Nashville, which occurred on December 15 and 16, 1864. It shows the outer edge of Union lines where the Army was camped and preparing for battle. The Battle of Nashville was a decisive moment in the American Civil War when Union forces, under the command of General George H. Thomas, defeated the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General John Bell Hood. The photo depicts trenches after the Battle of Petersburg in 1865, at the end of the American Civil War. The Battle of Petersburg in Virginia was a prolonged siege that lasted from June 1864 to April 1865, and was decisive for the war's end. The trenches were a notable feature of this battle, where Union and Confederate troops fought under exhausting conditions. The destruction in Richmond, Virginia in 1865 at the end of the American Civil War. Richmond, the Confederate capital, suffered intense bombardments and fighting due to its strategic importance and symbolism for the Confederate effort. During the evacuation and capture by the Union, a devastating fire was set, causing the destruction of much of the city, including warehouses, bridges, and industrial buildings, as shown in the scene in the photo. The image shows the deck of the USS Monitor, the famous Union ironclad, in 1862 during the American Civil War. The Monitor was one of the first armored ships of the United States Navy, revolutionizing naval warfare with its innovative design, including a rotating turret as seen in the photo. A cockfight is taking place at the headquarters of General Orlando B. Wilcox in Petersburg, Virginia, in 1864, during the American Civil War. This type of entertainment was common among soldiers and officers during the rare moments of rest. The scene highlights the daily life of the military, who, despite the difficult conditions of the war, found ways to entertain themselves. Carver Hospital in Washington, D.C., housed wounded soldiers during the Civil War, providing a care environment amid the conflict. The visible flag in the image features the Great Star design of 33 stars, a pattern that symbolized the Union and was quite popular among Northern sympathizers. In the image, we see Jefferson Davis, who was the President of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865 during the American Civil War. Before leading the Confederacy, Davis served as the United States Secretary of War and was a senator from Mississippi. After the Southern states' defeat, he was captured by Union forces, indicted for treason, and imprisoned for 2 years. In 1869, his case was dismissed, and he was released without trial. Davis lived for 2 more decades, during which he dedicated himself to writing and defending the South's views. The crowd gathered during the dedication ceremony of the Gettysburg National Cemetery on November 19, 1863, where President Abraham Lincoln delivered the famous Gettysburg Address. In the speech, which lasted only a few minutes, Lincoln emphasized the importance of honoring the soldiers who gave their lives on that battlefield and reinforced the nation's commitment to the principles of freedom and equality. The image depicts the building of Price, Birch and Company, a slave trading company located in Alexandria, Virginia, during the 19th century. This building symbolizes a dark time in U.S. history when the trade of enslaved people was a legal and common practice, especially in the southern states. This shows President Abraham Lincoln in a meeting with General George B. McClellan inside the general's tent in Antietam, Maryland, during the period from September to October 1862. This meeting occurred shortly after the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War, where both Union and Confederate forces suffered heavy casualties. Captain John J. Hoff's camp in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July 1865, shortly after the end of the American Civil War. Soldiers and civilians gather under the shade of trees. The peaceful scene contrasts with what had occurred 2 years earlier when Gettysburg was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April 1861. The first shots of the Civil War occurred here on April 12, 1861, when Confederate batteries opened fire on the Union fort, bombarding it for 34 hours straight. On April 13th, Union forces surrendered and evacuated the fort. The Union made many attempts to retake the fort during the war, but only regained possession on February 22, 1865, after Confederate forces evacuated Charleston. Confederate soldiers are marching through the streets of Frederick, Maryland in 1862, a city occupied by Union enemy forces. During the Maryland Campaign, the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee, advanced into Northern Territory, bringing the war directly to Union soil. A completely destroyed street in Richmond, Virginia, shortly after the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederate States, was devastated by fire and bombardments in the conflict's final days, especially when Confederate troops in retreat set fire to supply depots to prevent them from falling into Union hands. A quiet moment of reflection near Sudley Church, near Bull Run, Virginia, in March 1862. Two soldiers kneel on the ground, remembering the dead in an area marked by the memory of intense fighting in the region. Sudley Church, located near the Bull Run battlefields, served as an improvised hospital for both sides during the confrontations, housing wounded soldiers in one of the first major engagements of the American Civil War. The photo depicts the port of Yorktown, Virginia, during the embarkation of troops and supplies for the landing at White House, Virginia, as part of the Peninsula Campaign, which took place between May and August 1862 during the American Civil War. This was a major moment in the Eastern Theater of War, where the Union Army, under General George B. McClellan, attempted to advance up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. On May 21, 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant, General George G. Meade, Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana, and Union staff officers gather at Appomattox Church, Virginia. This strategic meeting, known as the Council of War, took place amid the Overland Campaign, where Grant and his commanders discussed the next moves against the Confederate Army. The hydrogen gas-powered balloon Intrepid was one of the most advanced reconnaissance tools of the Union Army Balloon Corps during the American Civil War. Operated by the Balloon Corps, led by Chief Aeronaut Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, the Intrepid was used to obtain an aerial view of battlefields, allowing strategic observations of enemy positions and Confederate troop movements. A pontoon bridge built near Petersburg, Virginia, in April 1865 by the Union Army, shortly before the end of the American Civil War. This temporary structure allowed troops and supplies to be quickly transported across the river, enabling strategic military operations during the Siege of Petersburg. These bridges were a practical solution for crossing natural obstacles and maintaining the mobility of forces in a critical period of the war. A group of men from Company B, U.S. Engineer Battalion, is gathered near Petersburg, Virginia in August 1864 during the American Civil War. These engineers played a crucial role in the war effort, building and repairing bridges, roads, fortifications, and trenches to support military operations. The USS Cairo, a Union ironclad gunboat sailing on the Mississippi River in 1862. Part of the Western gunboat flotilla, the Cairo was designed to patrol and control southern waterways during the American Civil War. Known for its ironclad exterior, this ship was one of 7 in the City class and played a significant role in the Union's naval operations in the West. The photo shows 3 men sitting at the base of a column among the ruins of Charleston, South Carolina, in 1865, after the end of the American Civil War. The city was largely destroyed by bombardments and fires during the conflict, especially in the war's final year. In the background, the remains of buildings reveal the war's devastating impact on urban infrastructure. The CSS Atlanta, a Confederate ironclad, is shown anchored in the James River after its capture by Union forces in June 1863. Originally built by the Confederates to fight the Union Navy, this warship posed a significant threat with its armored hull and powerful artillery. However, after a series of battles in Wassaw Sound, Georgia, the Atlanta was severely damaged and forced to surrender. The photo shows a group of contrabands, a term used at the time to describe freed or escaped slaves seeking refuge in Union lines, gathered in front of a building in Cumberland Landing, Virginia, on May 14, 1862. During the American Civil War, many enslaved people took advantage of the Union troops' approach to escape from their owners and seek freedom. A mail wagon designated for the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, stationed in Falmouth, Virginia, in March 1863. During the American Civil War, mail wagons played a vital role in transporting correspondence and orders between the front lines and command centers. Robert Smalls, one of South Carolina's most notable African-American legislators, is remembered for his bravery and contributions during and after the American Civil War. Born enslaved, he gained his freedom in 1862 through a heroic act. He seized the Confederate ship CSS Planter and delivered it to Union forces. This feat not only secured his freedom, but also made him a symbol of resistance and hope for many. 3 Confederate prisoners, known as Johnny Reb, were captured by Union forces during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. This confrontation marked one of the decisive moments of the American Civil War, representing the turning point against the Confederate forces' advance into the North. General Ulysses S. Grant and 5 of his officers gather at Lookout Mountain near Chattanooga, Tennessee, in November 1863, shortly after a decisive victory over Confederate forces. The victory at Chattanooga was a strategic milestone, opening the way for the Union's advance through the South and solidifying Grant's reputation as a determined and relentless leader. The CSS Stonewall was a 390-ton ironclad built in Bordeaux, France, in 1864, destined for the Confederate Navy during the American Civil War. Designed with heavy armor and a reinforced prow for ramming attacks, the Stonewall was one of the most advanced warships of its time. African-American escapees crossed the Rappahannock River, Virginia, in August 1862 during the retreat of General John Pope. Taking advantage of the Union troops' withdrawal as a chance to escape to northern-controlled territories, the crossing of rivers like the Rappahannock was dangerous and required courage, especially in a wartime setting. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, known as Wild Rose, appears in this photo alongside her daughter inside the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. As an influential Confederate spy, Greenhow used her connections in Washington's social elite to pass important information to the South during the American Civil War. In 1861, she was captured by the famous detective Allan Pinkerton and spent almost a year imprisoned before being released and deported to Richmond, Virginia, where she was welcomed by Confederate sympathizers. Later, Greenhow played the role of Confederate diplomat and traveled to Europe, where she wrote and published her memoirs in London in 1863. These memoirs became quite popular and helped fund her efforts for the Southern cause. In October 1864, while returning home aboard a blockade runner, her ship was pursued by a Union vessel near the coast of North Carolina. In an attempt to escape, the rowboat she was on capsized, and Greenhow drowned, taking gold and confidential documents with her. This image depicts Richmond, Virginia in 1865, during the final days of the American Civil War. Richmond, which served as the Confederate capital, was a strategic center and target of intense fighting. In the war's final days before its surrender, the city suffered great destruction when the Confederates set warehouses and factories ablaze to prevent them from falling into Union hands. One of the earliest recorded images of the Union Army in action during the American Civil War, taken around 1861. The photograph captures Union soldiers in formation and ready for combat, a rare and impressive record from an era when photographic technology was still limited in capturing action scenes. Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of President Abraham Lincoln, in a series of studio portraits. Known for her role as First Lady of the United States during the Civil War, Mary Todd faced intense public criticism and personal struggles, including the loss of children and the emotional strain of the war. Crew members of the USS Wissahickon, a Union Navy gunboat, posed beside the ship's cannon around 1863. The Wissahickon actively participated in various operations during the American Civil War, including blockading Confederate ports and supporting coastal attacks. Union soldiers operating large mortars during the Siege of Yorktown in 1862. These mortars were used to bombard Confederate positions intensively and continuously, exerting pressure on the enemy in trenches and fortifications. The heavy weapons required well-trained teams to operate, and their destructive power helped prepare for the Union troops' advance. Soldiers of the 50th New York Engineer Battalion are constructing a road on the south bank of the North Anna River near Jericho Mills. This work was vital for the Union troops' movement during the 1864 Overland Campaign, allowing vehicles and heavy equipment to be transported more easily through remote and challenging terrain. This illustration, titled Scott's Great Snake, represents the Anaconda Plan, a Union strategy during the American Civil War conceived by General Winfield Scott. The plan aimed to economically suffocate the Confederacy by imposing a naval blockade that would prevent trade and supply to the southern states. The snake encircling the map symbolizes the blockade around the Confederate states, slowly strangling them like an anaconda does to its prey. Francis E. Brownell, Union soldier and Medal of Honor recipient, is pictured here wearing the distinctive Zouave uniform. He holds a musket with a bayonet, reflecting the readiness posture of soldiers at the time. On his left arm, Brownell wears a black mourning crepe for Colonel Elmer E. Ellsworth, a close friend of Abraham Lincoln and the first Union officer to die in the American Civil War. In October 1862, Allan Pinkerton, known by the pseudonym E.J. Allen, poses on horseback in Antietam, Maryland. As the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency and an agent of the Union Secret Service, he played a crucial role during the American Civil War by providing critical intelligence for the Union Army. Pinkerton is widely recognized for his investigative skills and for establishing espionage methods that helped protect President Abraham Lincoln and dismantle Confederate conspiracies. The Harewood General Hospital, located in Washington, D.C., operated from September 1862 to May 1866, serving wounded soldiers during the American Civil War. This image depicts the interior of one of its wards in 1864, showing rows of beds arranged to maximize space and allow for the simultaneous care of many patients. David E. Harold, pictured here, was one of the conspirators in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. He was captured at the Washington Navy Yard between April and July 1865 after fleeing with John Wilkes Booth, the man who shot Lincoln. Harold assisted Booth during his escape, guiding him and helping him navigate southern Maryland. After an intense pursuit, Booth and Harold were finally found in a barn in Virginia. General Fitzjohn Porter's staff is gathered in front of a tent in Falmouth, Virginia, in 1863 during the American Civil War. Among the officers present is Lieutenant William G. Jones and the then-young George A. Custer, who would later become a famous cavalry general in the United States. In Dutch Gap, Virginia, in November 1864, African-American Union soldiers are depicted in active duty, marking a significant shift in Union military policies during the American Civil War. As the conflict prolonged and the need for more soldiers increased, the Union lifted restrictions, allowing black men, both formerly enslaved and free, to enlist and fight for the freedom and future of the United States. Gordon, an enslaved man who escaped to freedom and reached Union lines during the American Civil War, is depicted here. Taken in 1863, the photograph reveals the deep scars on his back, a result of numerous whippings he suffered while enslaved. Known as Whipped Peter, he became a powerful symbol of the brutality of slavery in the United States. The photograph was widely used by abolitionists to show the public the cruel reality of the slave system and strengthen the abolition movement. A group of Union officers is gathered in front of a tent during the American Civil War in 1864 near Petersburg, Virginia. This group of officers was part of the forces commanded by General George G. Meade, responsible for the Army of the Potomac. The Gettysburg Campaign was one of the longest of the war, lasting from June 1864 to April 1865, and culminated in the surrender of Confederate forces at Appomattox. On June 18, 1864, during one of the Civil War battles, Alfred Stratton, then only 19, had both arms struck by cannon fire. He survived but had to face the permanent consequences of this brutal injury. Alfred became part of a grim statistic. Approximately 1 in every 13 soldiers in the American Civil War suffered amputations due to severe injuries. Workers removing the remains of soldiers after the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in July 1863 during the American Civil War. In the field, soldiers' bones, including skulls and fragments of uniforms, are carefully collected for proper burial. Jacob Miller, a veteran of the American Civil War, was struck by a bullet in the head directly between his eyes during a battle. Miraculously, he survived the wound and lived with the open injury for over 30 years. His remarkable survival was considered nearly impossible, especially given the medical knowledge and practices of the time.